So you got the plugin up and running and you want to splinify your warps now. So you're probably familiar with this. If you're not familiar with motion warping, there's a link in the description. You can read a bit on that. I assume you have some prior knowledge, but even if you don't, you could probably follow along this tutorial pretty well. So we got this motion warping going on here, right? The regular or notify state motion warp. And you got this default skew warp. I got the name here of the warp target to just warp, super creative by me. And then we have this particular thing, which you're probably also familiar with if you used this before, make motion warp targets, and we use an add update target, and we play the animation. Not much else to it. We set flying before, we set it back to walking once we're done. And then we have this little thing checking if we're already playing, so we don't try and restart this animation before we're done. We unset it to playing once we are done. So what does that look like? That looks like this. Oh no, there's no spline warping, right? This is just a regular skew warp. Cool. Now we want to splinify our little warp here. So how do we go about doing that? We go to our motion warping selected in the details panel. We go to root motion modifier and you do spline warp. Now you can see you got some new settings. They're not very fancy, but you got some rotational settings and whatnot. You can also use warp rotation here as a setting. That defaults to using this rotation you're probably familiar with from the skew warp. For the purposes of demonstrating this right now, we're just going to keep it to the default. However, we're going to have to put in the warp name here once again. Press save. And if we do play this time, nothing happens. Well, shit. No, that's actually correct. We're not feeding in any spline component yet. So we're gonna need to feed in a spline component. Now, you might have an instinct to immediately go and add a spline component here. You don't want to do that, and I can demonstrate pretty quickly why you don't want to do that. And while doing so, I'm going to talk about the reason for that. I'm going to set this up here. And the reason for that mainly is that because the spline is inheriting from the character, it's going to follow along when we're warping. So this spline here, even though it's not going to be very far, it's still gonna update along. So let's see what that looks like. Drag the spline in here, drag it into the component. I'm gonna also enable debug so we can sort of see what's going wrong. And once you do, you're gonna see, oh no, we fly much further than the spline appears to be. And that's because we're moving the spline every time. So probably don't want to do this. Instead, I propose you do something similar to what I'm doing here, but how you set this up, that you can decide on your own. Now, I have a warp spline actor, which defaults to having this spline inside of it. And inside the same folder here, I have one that inherits from it. It's called leap. And the difference with that is it has a longer spline sort of curve right here. Now, in order to get that to our actual like motion warp target here, I'm gonna have to spawn it, but that way it's detached. So I'm gonna spawn the leap, and I'm gonna get the spline from it, and feed it into the component. Now I'm also gonna have to make a spawn transform, otherwise I get this error here. So I'm gonna do make transform. I'm going to utilize the same sort of things we did for the regular warp, the skew warp. So we're going to spawn it in direction of the camera. So the spline is going to be relative position of the mesh and rotated in the direction of the camera. And then we're going to utilize that spline respawning here. And actually, once we're done here, I'm also going to destroy this actor. You see, I already set this up. How clever of me. All right. So once we're done, I'm just going to destroy the actor. Now, you can try and reuse the same actor over and over if you want to. That way, I can now actually have some stuff going on. Now, you could probably see that I was traveling along, and that's because I have accidentally left this little tick on here. I'm going to demonstrate what that does in a bit, but for now, we're going to see, oh, okay, cool, that works. Got a spline going on. We can sort of spline motion warp up and spline motion warp down. And these red little debugs right here, they're to indicate that we are actually tracing the position up and down. And that's because of how I set up my spline actor. You don't have to set it up like this, but you can see it as a construction script, trace grounded location, and it sort of uses the last position of the spline. So the very end, and it traces both, moves it up a little bit and then moves it down from the original location and sees if it hits anything. And if it does, it sets that location instead. If you want to do something like this, be sure to use the same coordinate space when doing this, because that I forgot. But that's that working. Then, because this is something that is resampled at runtime, you can have, like here, the tick going on, which moves the spline along while we're actually warping along it. So now we're moving the position of the spline while we're actually warping. So let me show you what that looks like. So you can see the spline is actually moving and we're still managing to progress along it. So you can manipulate the spline. You can imagine having a target that is moving that you want to warp to or whatever. And yeah, you can move the endpoint of the spline, for example. All right, that's pretty much it for setting up the spline. If you have any problem with this, hit me up on a Discord or the email. I'll get to you as fast as I can. Best of luck. Enjoy.